So beginning verse 9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. I'm going to hand over to Mikey.
May I add my welcome to Chris. It's really good to see you all here this Thursday lunchtime. Well, what does God think of his world? When he looks down at humanity, what does he see and feel? Well, we might expect him to sort of notice the smiling babies, the children playing, the great achievements of mankind, and to feel proud of us. But if you've been with us in our series in Romans so far, we've seen that God looks at humanity and sees wickedness and is angry. God is rightly angry at humanity's unrighteousness. For 2 long chapters now, Paul has been doing an absolute demolition job on humanity, spelling out our failings, piling up the evidence to show that we really do, by nature, deserve God's judgment. Last week, the final objections and protests were dealt with and discarded as baseless. God is totally right and justified to judge all people, the Jews, just as well as much as non-Jews. And today really rounds it all off. Verse 9 is a key verse in our passage today. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, that is non-Jews, are under sin. Paul says, I've already made the charges, but this, if you like, is his closing summary, the court case against humanity, the final verdict, you could say. I put it down on your sheets as the main point, how everyone lives in sin, that's verse 9, and also, therefore, deserves God's judgment. That second bit flows from verse 19, that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. And those 2 key verses really sum up this devastating verdict on humanity. We're all under sin, and God will hold us accountable. We really do deserve God's judgment. You'll notice that Paul still frames this as though addressing the Jews, but that is just his way of really showing that this failure of humanity applies to all. One commentator explains, if the Jews, the people who might seem to have reason to regard themselves as an exception, are in fact no exception, then without doubt the entire human race lies under God's judgment. See, the Jews had been at an advantage because they'd been given God's word. But our passage here is filled with Old Testament quotes to show how their own scriptures even condemn them, and thus extinguishing hope that any of humanity could follow God rightly. So let's get a feel for these quotes here. And the first thing they really emphasize is that no one is righteous. You can't really miss it in verses 10 to 12 if you have a look down there. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Paul just drills it home, doesn't he? Again and again. No one has done what is right before God. There are no exceptions, not the Jews, not anyone. So easy, isn't it, to look down on others, but to consider ourselves the exception. Oh, I'm a decent person, aren't I? Well, Paul says no. God says no. No one does good, not even one. I mean, not even the most upstanding person that we can think of, that really nice person in your office, or that friend who took time to help you. No, by nature, none of them are good in God's eyes. Not Her Majesty the Queen, not Mother Teresa, not the Pope. No, every one of them lives in sin. But how can this be? What is it that we've all done that is so bad by God's standards? Well, that is our next observation. No one is righteous because all have turned from God. See how that bookends the quotes that we're given. First, verse 11, no one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside from God. And then Paul finishes with verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. See, humanity's unrighteousness stems from our natural heart attitude towards God, or away from God, I should say. We have all turned from the God who lovingly made us, thinking we can do better without him in the picture. Frank Sinatra's famous song sums it up. I'll do it my way. What an indictment it is on humanity that is such a loved and celebrated song, the most popular song at UK funerals, championing the way that people live. We love going our own way. None of us, not even the religious, ultimately seek God's way. Not really. We grab his gifts, but by nature we refuse to fear or acknowledge his lordship over us. We reject our ruler. We shun our creator. It may not always be that obvious to others. We may not even be aware of it ourselves sometimes. But that doesn't stop this from being the most wicked, the most outrageous, the most unrighteous thing we ever could have done. We may not be convicted criminals in any human court, but in God's courtroom, we have committed the most serious crime of all. You could call it divine treason against the King of the universe. Of course, God is right to judge humanity. And in fact, chapter 1 said that God has already started to hand humanity over to judgment in various ways. And that is really what is highlighted next. Because turning from God produces a horrific state. That's what these verses show. If we have a look down from verse 13 and just try to take in the force of these quotes. This is a description of all humanity. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. Well, it's just the most horrific picture, isn't it? It's so unpleasant, but this is where turning from God leads. I don't know if you've ever had this experience with a piece of fruit, but the other day I bit into a pear, and the whole thing was just totally moldy. You could just taste it instantly, totally disgusting. I just had to spit it out straight away. I'll admit I had noticed that there was one bit on the side that had looked a little bit manky, so I'd cut that off, assuming the rest would be fine. But anywhere I bit, it was just that disgusting, moldy taste. Clearly this rottenness was just in the core, and it infected the whole thing. And in a similar way, trying to live without God, it just infects every part of life. It makes us rotten to the core, you could say. And God would be right to just do away with us straight away. It's amazing that he doesn't, really. See, these verses seem to picture our internal rejection of God spreading throughout us so that every part of our bodies are kind of spewing out this horrible godlessness. The first place it is identified as surfacing, as so often is the case, is in the mouth, in the things that we say. I mean, I wonder how many lies regularly fly around our workplaces. See, if we are determined to do things my way, we'll end up being willing to deceive others, to hold back the truth, to give false impressions. It's all like deadly venom. It's harmful to others, all driven by our selfish hearts. And when we don't get our way, well, curses, bitterness are never far away. That then sets the agenda for our feet next in the verses, the paths we choose to take, our whole direction of life. Instinctively, we are just quick to push others out the way. We don't care that much if it destroys harmony amongst peers. If there's, say, a promotion going, making friends and keeping peace kind of goes out the window, even if it causes others misery or strife. We're all wired to look out for number one. Could sum up the progression of those quotes like this: godless hearts lead to selfish tongues, and selfish tongues leads to strife for all. See, when our hearts are out of step with God's truth and his goodness, then our whole lives will be as well. Well, I apologize, it's a pretty unpalatable passage for a lunch break, isn't it? But what should we make of all of this? Well, I think Paul leads us to three key implications. First, we're to see the horror of godlessness. I think that's what Paul wants. The previous two chapters, he'd already proved how humanity just really languishes in rampant sin. So why does he feel the need again here to sort of summarize it all, go over it all again in such graphic detail? Well, it must be to just really press home the horror of our natural state without God. We are forced to just dwell on it until it really sinks in. It's so easy just to dismiss this, say, oh, that's not me, I'm not that bad. But when we take a bit of time, when I was thinking about these verses, I found them actually horribly exposing and familiar. Even as a Christian, lots of what I do is still tainted by impure motive. Or think of our colleagues, perhaps. Some of them will seem, no doubt, very nice on the surface. But imagine we get back to the office and everyone is dressed in these sort of ghastly sort of Halloween outfits, blood all over their face, hands and feet. Or maybe you jump on a video call this afternoon, and so as though everyone's got one of those filters on, but it's not one of those silly cats or one of those silly hats or things, but rather gaping, rotten mouths, like open graves. And you notice a forked tongue dripping venom. And what if you were to realize that these aren't filters or fancy dress? This is the reality, spiritually speaking. See, that is what God, I think, wants us to see here and to feel and to respond to. I mean, I rarely think of sin as being that ghastly. But we need to appreciate the horror of humanity's situation without God. And not only the horror, but also the hopelessness of it, which is our next implication, the hopelessness of self-justification. It is astounding that society has so convinced itself that we are generally good and that God, if there is a God, should be pleased with us, when the truth is the very opposite. Perhaps the biggest shock of these verses is that they're actually aimed at the devout rabbi. I mean, even the most respectable person that we can think of is selfish, ruthless, and rightly unacceptable to God. They will be held accountable for the way that they live, even the most religious, apparently law-abiding person. I say apparently because the whole point is that no one truly abides by God's law, not even the rabbi. If we try to meet God's standards in our own strength, we're doomed from the start. It's simply impossible. I mean, have a look at verse 20. By works of the law, that is, trying to do it ourselves, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Even if we're privileged to know God's law, we mustn't kid ourselves that we can keep it. The law only exposes how far short we fall. We may be decent by society's human standards, but God's word shows that we are not good at all. There is no way that we can justify ourselves after what we've done, after how we've treated God, turned away from him. And so the conclusion is verse 19. We know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. God's verdict on the whole world is guilty. We are left without any argument, every mouth stopped, speechless. Last week, if you hear, I mentioned Stephen Fry's rant accusing God of injustice and wrongdoing. But on that final day, the likes of Stephen Fry will be totally silenced. There will be no more protests of God being unfair. Anyone who remain turned away from God will realize that they have no excuses, no defense, no appeals to their good deeds that they might have done in their lifetime, or church going even. They'll know that that makes no difference. They'll know that they deserve judgment if they have remained turned away from God. And yet for now, just so many still presume that they're just fine. I mean, if you were to take a straw poll amongst your colleagues, those you regularly rub shoulders with, I wonder what they would say about the prospect of facing judgment. I suspect many would say, I'm a decent enough person. I'll take my chances if there is a God. Well, it's so tragic, isn't it? Because relying on ourselves to justify ourselves, it's simply hopeless. They are in a desperate situation, and yet they don't even know it. And that brings us to our final implication. This has to drive us towards the hope of the gospel. See, we have been shown the utter horror of life lived my way in order that we might cling all the more onto God's way, onto the gospel. We need to feel the absolute hopelessness of trying to justify ourselves before we'll appreciate the sheer wonder of the solution in Jesus. I've just been really struck by how much we really need this bad news. I mean, some people want to make the gospel more palatable by leaving out all this talk of rebellion against God and deserving his judgment. They'll say we should just talk of positive things, Jesus offering comfort and satisfaction in the here and now. But Paul would disagree. He'd say we must resist that temptation because it fails to show people their need for Jesus. See, if we just offer satisfaction now, many people will say, oh, thanks, but I'm fine, actually. I don't need that. And more importantly, that is because that is not the real gospel. Not according to Romans, not according to the Bible. The gospel is something that everyone needs because we are all, by nature, facing God's wrath. The gospel is not primarily about satisfaction in this life. It is about salvation for all eternity. We mustn't water that down. We need to see how bad the bad news is before we can see how good the good news is. I mean, how incredible that God offers mercy to such wretched, undeserving creatures as us. How astounding that he would forgive all of our wicked rebellion and freely offer to put it all right. How precious it is to be rescued from such a terrible judgment that we so deserve. You see, this is the gospel that makes us truly thankful to the Lord in the right way. This is the gospel that strengthens us to be truly unashamed around others. I mean, if we really saw our colleagues in the way that this passage describes, well, wouldn't that just help us to really look for every opportunity in those half moments where we're unsure whether to stick our head above the parapet? Wouldn't this impress upon us the urgency and the importance of the task all around us?